Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Marie-Claude Allard, the Communication Lead for CNU, the Canadian Urban Environmental Research Consortium. This is the sixth webinar from our equity-based climate adaptation project, which is being done in collaboration with CHASE, the Canadian Health Association for Sustainability and Equity, with funding from the FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. I would like to start by acknowledging that the Université de Montréal, where I work, is located on non-treaty Aboriginal territory. This land has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples. I wish to pay tribute to those who since time immemorial have been its traditional custodians. Before we get started, I would like to remind you to turn off your camera and stay on mute during the webinar. If you have questions during the presentations, please put them in the chat. Our speakers will answer questions at the end of the session. Also, this presentation will be recorded and sent to all registered participants after the webinar. And now I will pass you on to Kim Perrotta, the Executive Director of CHASE, who will moderate this session.
Thanks, Marie-Claude. Today's webinar will focus on an innovative project led by the City of Vancouver. With this project, Vancouver was working to weave equity considerations and Indigenous knowledge with engineering science to address a coastal erosion resulting from rising sea levels and storm surges amplified by climate change. Our speakers today are Angela Danyluk, the Manager of Climate Adaptation and Equity in the Sustainability Group at the City of Vancouver, and Cory Douglas, a cultural design advisor and planner, who's the lead design consultant for modern Formline Design. Over to you, Angela and Cory.
This presentation, I'll give a bit of the technical setup, and then Cory will take over some of the work that we did on decolonization and bringing in Indigenous perspectives into this work. Before we get started, I just wanted to start in a good way, acknowledge where I'm coming from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I have the privilege of working, living in play here. And this project that we are going to share with you took place on the lands around that we call now False Creek, but really has a rich history and has been and continues to be stewarded by the First Nation peoples here in Vancouver. So really grateful for that time, which was 2020-ish to 2022-ish to work with Cory and others and learn. So just talk a little bit about the technical challenge. So climate change, that old thing. And then the place where this took place, False Creek, and then get into the project itself. It's a values-based planning approach, and then discuss outcomes and outputs. And we've got a discussion after. So what's the challenge? Basically, like most coastal cities, we are planning for a certain amount of sea level rise. And on the West Coast, we're planning for about 50-ish centimeters by mid-century, and then 100 centimeters by the end of the century. And so we like to show this that someone born today will experience that amount of sea level rise in their lifetime. And there's, like the predicted amount of sea level rise, and then the light blue is the uncertainty, because a lot of things can unravel and happen as we fail to curb our carbon pollution. And in Vancouver, it rains a lot, which I'm sure you've heard about. I mean, we don't shovel it. Thinking about you folks back east, be careful, but I guess you're getting your workout. And so we need to think about this work not in silos, but also like looking at these other hazards and how the land works. So we need to think about rain when we plan for higher ocean levels, because we get pooling, we have old stormwater or storm sewers that I'm sure like everyone has that. We all have old infrastructure that's failing. And so there are problems. And so this is kind of what we think of as planners and engineers, biologists and cultural advisors when we think of planning for sea level rise. And we used to just think about, like existing water levels, some storm surge, wind, but now we have to think about sea level rise. And so this graphic is kind of over the top, but it does happen in some of our coastal areas. And so we need to plan. So we've got a flood map here for Vancouver. The dark blue shows what is vulnerable today if we don't do any adaptation. We're still vulnerable today to a major storm, but in the future, with that major storm and sea level rise, our floodplain actually expands. And we know we already experience damage, which is in theme with the coastal erosion from our storm surge events currently. I mean, we got a freaking barge pushed up onto the seawall a couple years ago. And Kit's Pool we're just undergoing a extensive redesign process right now because it's physically in the wrong place and is being undermined now on an annual basis due to coastal storm surge damage. And so at the city, from doing all that technical work, we understood our priorities here. So we understand that False Creek is a place that has a lot of infrastructure, a lot of housing, a lot of use, and is vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal flooding towards the end of the century. And because of that complexity and criticality, we need to start planning now because we're government, and I will say it, we're slow. And so we need to understand what type of changes have to occur and then start the planning process now. I mean, that's why we did Sea to City. But before we think about the future, it's really important to recognize the past and that what this place was. And this is part where in this project, we had expressed goals to decolonize our perspectives, our practice, and reflect on how was this land, how was it before settlers came in and utterly destroyed False Creek, as it's known, and I've got a graphic to kind of show you what I mean by that. And so we know that that False Creek was very productive in terms of a place for culture, a place for food, a place for medicines, for materials. And you can see these I'm a biologist by trade, so you can see these shorelines are something what I call are much more softer and productive. They've got a lot more natural vegetation, natural shallower slopes. And actually,
Angela,
yeah,
can
go for
we
it. Yeah. Yeah, let's do
talk with
it.
each
Let's do
other
it.
about this? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
this was again, this was a really interesting project, and this was a first time project for me to understand the role that an Indigenous person could play. I worked very hard on putting together a proposal, and I'm gonna step away from this slide and then work towards it. So putting together an appropriate proposal, what does that look like from an Indigenous perspective with Indigenous knowledge and subject matter that could maybe help support this project? Well, what is a project schedule? What is a timeline? What are set deliverables? What are the fees associated with that? Very much a new realm for me. So now we're talking specifically about Indigenous knowledge that could be used in reference and support of new technical solutions, planning initiatives, and working alongside collaboratively with the design team. So I worked really hard with PWL to develop a proposal. And this was my first kick at, at least establishing myself as a professional in this field of study that, I was employed in as an architectural draftsman, but, kind of really getting a better understanding of what role I could play. So even assigning a name as a cultural consultant was something that is really new as well. What is it? What is a cultural consultant? What role does a cultural consultant play in a project of this scale? And how do I manage my deliverables? What are deliverables from a cultural consultant's perspective? So Angela and I worked really hard on, kind of evaluating what an appropriate approach would be, what a set of deliverables will be, and also finding, what an appropriate budget would be for a cultural consultant to be involved in a project, and how do we bridge the gap between a project of this scale to include other Indigenous voices beyond myself to be a part of this project, and what are those opportunities from a project deliverable system, and how do we schedule it with already an outline for a project like this. And projects like this do have a very atypical schedule, timeline, budget, and scope of potential work and initiatives. We will point specifically back at industry leaders, landscape architects, engineers, and so forth, the atypical players on a project like this. So how do we assign budget for a much deeper engagement with community members? And we did try and outline a little bit of a light scope of work, and a set of deliverables. So again, we were kind of exercising this as we were. What's that term? Build it as you fly, and that's exactly what we were doing here. So I worked really hard on putting together a little bit of a plan and a proposal with PWL, and it allowed me to also potentially work with our other team, Methuen. They had a cultural consultant in mind, and unfortunately, it didn't work out for Methuen to work with said cultural consultant. So I was now bridging my services to two different teams, but then becoming the conduit for a set of deliverables from a Coast Salish, from a Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh perspective to support the overall deliverable system for this project. So, again, it was now looking at this as an equity opportunity for a project, again, of this scale. There's a great wealth of knowledge that could be tapped into as a resource from our membership. And I am a Squamish Nation member. So how can we activate other community members from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh? And now we're talking about procurement initiatives. But Angela, in support of us looking at this collage of imagery, I also had taken an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the history of False Creek. At this particular time in my life, I didn't know that False Creek was backfilled. I didn't realize the impact of industrialization in this region of our territory. So not only was the team, being the entire consultancy team, learning a little bit more about the history of this place, but so was I. And what was the impact? What to Angela's point, what were the prior to contact uses of False Creek? How were the local nations utilizing this space in support of economy, in support of their community, in support of relationships between the three nations? So we were able to uncover a lot of that when we worked with our knowledge holders from the nations. Thanks, Angela.
Yeah, no, and thanks, Cory. And that's great. So that slide that Cory was speaking to showed how far False Creek used to extend. And then it was a unilateral decision by the federal and local government at that time to fill it in without any consultation or reparations to the host nations. And so when we look now at our present, this map shows again in that teal the original extent of False Creek, and then the blue is the floodplain. And thank you, Cory, for bringing up the how do we work together. So to folks on the call, as a project manager, you go through the procurement process. And so because I had already had an idea of what I wanted the project to be, I worked with folks on my team to be like, okay, how do we put in explicitly the role of a cultural advisor so that when teams would come to bid, they understood what I was asking for. And like Cory said, so Cory had paired up with one team, and the other team tried to also bring in a cultural advisor, but it didn't work out. And so we were able to be flexible, and that's the thing. We did build the plane while we were flying it, and we used flexibility as our tool belt to do that. And Cory coming onto the process was like, okay, like why don't we bring in a try mentoring model where it's Cory, another knowledge keeper, Charlene Alec from Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and then a youth who can mentor between Cory and Charlene, but also provide expertise and advice to the project as we go through. And so we engaged in that model. We unfortunately couldn't get the youth to, it didn't work for them, but we moved forward with working with Cory and Charlene. And then meanwhile, in my government position, I made formal referrals to the three host nations following the protocol that we have on a government to government basis. And two of the three had capacity, which I supported, to be government representatives and run through the project with us. So that was another. So I wanted to share that with the audience, that structural project management decolonization attempt that we started with, and then it ended up being something else, and that's okay. And I think that's the whole thing, is like it's okay to start one way and to end up in another way. And so this project that we're talking about, it's the Sea to City Design Challenge. We decided that we would try to address our sea level rise coastal adaptation planning challenges through a design lens, and did that intentionally because engineering, I love engineers. I'm married to one. I work with them, but like it's a total colonial construct in engineering. And it's on the West Coast, it's resulted in a lot of hard infrastructure, which keeps us safe, but there are alternatives that we can consider. And so I structured the program or the project to be led by either a landscape architect or a planner with cultural advisors, Cory and Charlene, to support the work. And so we then went on this journey of using community values, which we had already gathered from Vancouver community members. We'd also then talked to the host nations to say, hey, these are our values. How should we represent Indigenous knowledge? And so we co-created with them, with the representatives, that these bullets of describing how Indigenous knowledge and perspectives should show up. And that really laid a foundation, level setting, like these values with Indigenous knowledge values. And so we were able to move forward with a designer, say, this is the criteria that you're designing for. And then we had this whole accountability framework, getting the designers to answer back questions to the nations about how they were meeting or not meeting these points, and that it was okay. This is about learning and unlearning.
That's it. And
Go for
that's
it.
a good point. I mean, really, this exercise was so much fun in the way of, you know, looking at technical design solutions, which should be very much in line with industry standard practices. But how does it then how do you deconstruct it and bring Indigenous values and perspective? And that was kind of the fun exercise, is creating space for conversation. And conversation sometimes challenges project schedules and timelines and the demands of a project deliverable system. So now creating space for, again, conversation to be had, questions to be asked, and maybe potentially slowing down the process. I think this maybe talks about like an ROI system, return on investment, right? And I think as far as how a project and its deliverable system works, you work with a really tight schedule to make sure that the deliverables are in line. So finding opportunities to have conversation was something that we were co-developing, whether it be with the design team, with staff from the city, or with the city in collaboration and conversation with the host nations. Thanks, Angela.
Yeah, no, thank you. And yeah, flexibility. We also looked at our engagement differently. Well, I don't want to say differently, but maybe at the time intentionally, again, and this comes back as a tactic for folks to take home. If you're doing engagement, you typically have engagement plans or communication frameworks. And so use those tools and put in goals to amplify Indigenous voices, youth, who are elderly, vulnerable, disproportionately affected, and you will design something different. And so we had this online decolonizing the shoreline conversation where Cory and others answered that question. And it was June 2022. And okay, we were, coming out of the pandemic. Everyone was kind of online. But I don't know. I was being a public sector employee and doing engagement, I'm used to getting about 20 to maybe 100 people to come out. Over 300 people came out online to this event. We almost crashed the university who was hosting their system. And to me, it just showed how much interest and hunger there is for this topic. And it was just a really great conversation. And we talked about Guardian, an urban guardian program for waterways. And that's something that was seeded and that we're still talking about, still nurturing, and something that, I wouldn't be surprised if we have something in Vancouver like that in the next 20, 30 years. And it's not just this event, but it's just that these conversations are coming up and that there is interest in design and resourcing for this. We also we had a youth stream in the project. We hired City Hive. It's a youth by youth not-for-profit, and it focuses on building civic literacy, but also skill building. And I think that's another that's another decolonized perspective. How can you build reciprocity into your project? And for this example, it looked like, how can we support local youth organizations and support skill building, because we need some leadership. We we need these youth to be ready. And so this group worked with Cory, they worked with the designers, and they gave feedback to us. But there was also some mentoring. And yeah, Cory, over to you.
Yeah, instead of interrupting you, I'm going to throw my hand up with you, Angela, if you don't mind. And hopefully it won't be too distracting and break your concentration. So, I mean, networking. Let's talk about that. I mean, really, really important as an equitable business. Now, many businesses require time and space to meet like-minded individuals from the industry, from the community. This was a springboard project for me, and the trajectory, honestly, and I want to give credit to Angela and the team here. The level of success that I have reached, and I'm going to stand up on a pedestal just for a moment, but the projects that I'm on now really falls back on the level of success that we had found through Sea to City. I work with City Hive. I've been working with them now consecutively for 4 or 5 years as a mentor. My relationship with PWL is ongoing, and we are pursuing new projects, new clients. But again, coming back to the networking, Angela had opened up the doors for us to meet a broad spectrum of professionals from this field. She brought on a large number of industry leaders to come in and speak to the team, share perspective, and support this project in a number of ways. I think we had a number of professionals kind of come in and provide us with technical, right? So I met Space to Place, Jeff from Space to Place, and we're on a couple of projects together. So again, this was a great project that allowed us to really understand and appreciate cultural consultancy, the role that a cultural consultant can play. And the title that I have for my projects will change, all dependent on what the deliverable system is, what the project is requiring of me, who the client is. So again, I think coming back to the Youth Adaptation Lab, I really do enjoy my time that I have had with City Hive, and I continue working with them. Thanks, Angela.
That's cool. That's really good to hear. So I'm going to pivot a little bit to the projects. It's something that, yeah, Cory, you said about networking, And I just wanted to share with the audience, like I haven't seen all you all, so I don't know if like some of you know me or I know you, but like I've worked like half of my career for a smaller town, and I am very aware of the privilege, and I call it the fairy dust that the city of Vancouver has. Um, and so I would say that, yeah, when you talked about the technical advisory group, that was intentional too. We had a technical advisory group come in of that again that I paid a small stipend for their time. Geotechs, engineers, reps from BC Hydro, DFO, um, to come in and, shape what we were producing, but also to influence them. Networking is huge and peer-to-peer, right? Like influence is huge. So you don't have to have a large project to do that. Like I used to work on projects about ditching and like how should the ditches be? And like and working with the folks from ops about like, okay, tell me about how you cut the grass and they care but I'm like,
Right.
but we have to change it because we have to think about frogs or whatever. So
Right.
it just means like your projects are like these containers for influence and yeah, and at any scale.
And you're right, Angela. The siloed approach, it does happen, and I think that was kind of what we were intending on doing, was breaking down some of those barriers so that we were having a two-way dialogue, not only between disciplines, but also for someone like myself who I have an architectural and engineering background, and co-founder Shanti Williamson, who is also in attendance. We worked really hard to develop this business, and we're heavily dependent on pollinization, like being able to have conversations with industry leaders, whether it be architects, landscape architects, engineers, planners, public art consultants. We want to share our perspective and the indigenous values that we have modeled in modern formline design, and co-developed with everyone that we've worked with, but also to share with industry leaders as well. So the technical advisory team is or sorry, was and still is very much a need for us to continue developing our skills, our knowledge, and our ability to have an intellectual conversation about a very complex topic, which is indigeneity, which is truth and reconciliation, which is UNDRIP. How do you activate culture or indigenous values or history of place into a project? So, very much appreciative of the time that we were able to spend with the technical advisory team, our time with PWL and Methuen on this project. Thanks, Angela.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into getting into the outputs because I've got the slides about the language coming up. And so we've recapped like, the hazards, the technical things, the project, and how we kind of use different tactics and structures to decolonize the work and learn and unlearn. And so the project produced a lot of stuff. It's all online, vancouver.ca/sea to city. The two is the number. So at a high level, we created a vision for False Creek. We made some commitments, we changed the language, we've got some site concepts, and we've got some pilot projects. And I'm just going to go through a high level some of it. So this was first. When we talk about adaptation, we typically talk about resist, accommodate the water, and then we move and avoid. Well, after a couple sessions, Cory and the team thought, what is this colonialism that is here? And really like interrogated and created new words, which we are now using at the city. Like Cory, like people are like, Angela, like we're moving to acknowledge, or we've got to be hosting. And because I as part of the project, I picked and cajoled and invited about 30 staff who We're at different levels in the organization across different departments. Because again, pollination. We want to pollinate, cross-pollinate our ideas. And so this language change is represents a huge shift in norms, which we're still working towards. We're definitely not 100% bought into all of this all the time, but it's starting to change. Cory, I know you're going to want to speak to this.
I do, and I think this is the real fun part of, working in collaboration. And let me just put how important that is. The collaborative efforts are very necessary to clearly understand intention, and intention from an Indigenous perspective, which is aligning Indigenous values with, again, like technical solutions. And I want to give PWL credit here. And co-founder Shanti is, we are always trying to find ways to better inform from a singular term of reference a word that best describes said intention and align with values. And I share this a lot with a lot of like the projects and the clients and the teams that I work with. The English language is a foreign language to our Indigenous people, but I don't know the Squamish language fluently. I know a few words, but again, trying to understand an appropriate word to describe intention. And this was very much Sophie from PWL who kind of like spearheaded this and questioned and inquired with not just me, but with our knowledge holder, Charlene Alec, what would be some good terms of reference that could best describe, what our potential value system and how we work through a technical solution that restores or acknowledges or hosts a new design element. Thanks, Angela.
Yeah. And this is a snapshot of the future vision. And so there's a couple of things on the board here. One is that there's the written format and it's, a couple paragraphs, but then there's this visual below it, which is a 2100 rendering a rendering showing a certain site at 2100 and showcasing some of the elements that we hope to design for. And so this is kind of like, this was one of the key deliverables, these images, so that we could, we're very visual. We need to see the thing. And it's really hard with coastal adaptation, coastal erosion projects, however you want to call it. We're very locked into a riprap 3-to-1 slope. So nature-based solutions are really hard to come by. And so this image shows, again, a softer shoreline, places for people to recreate, places for nature, economy, accessibility on the shoreline. And then we even got into zeroing into cross sections that showcase, a different type of coastal adaptation. So this is a raised berm that is proposed to go outside of Olympic Village when the time is right to protect the rest of the low-lying lands from flooding. But what is different is that you don't normally see trees on dikes like that. And this is a berm. So this was conversations again with Cory and Charlene about values. What is important? The cedar tree, having these treed areas in the city. We don't have a lot in the city. And so that's just an example about how like bringing Indigenous perspectives into this design and how it landed here. And maybe I'll get to here. And then we've got a couple more slides that show like the last, like kind of the South Shore. So this was on the south side, or this is the south side of False Creek by Methuen. And what they're showing here is like current state. These are these current homes. And then this is like a blue-green corridor that, attenuates stormwater that's coming up from Broadway, but also is acting as the line. Like that will be the new like berm, dike, and that these buildings when they go to retire, when they're end of life, within the density would move here. And again, I'm going to say this is not a decision, but these are concepts that we um looked at to see, could we do this? Because this could be 2100 in that area. Cory, over to you.
Yeah, these were really kind of exciting kind of planning initiatives, and really kind of get a better understanding. To Angela's point, is how can we soften the edges? What does that look like when you soften the edges from an Indigenous planning perspective? And again, I think this really kind of exercised the ability to inform the team on some, again, like some softening of the edges, accessibility. What does accessibility mean from a project perspective, from a technical perspective? We looked at opportunities for the water to breach those hardened edges and have some floodplains incorporated, some blue-green corridors, to Angela's point. And it was came with a big question. What happens with the buildings that we're proposing to maybe potentially relocate the residents there? But again, like this was very much a planning exercise, planning in a way that it is co-designed with Indigenous values. And we had some really, really interesting conversations internally that allowed us to kind of share a little bit of our process with the community as well. Thank you, Angela.
Yeah, and I want to say that these aren't just pretty pictures. There's a lot of engineering that goes behind these because we worked with engineers to get this. And this particular spot here, there is a high pressure sewer or storm sewer force main that is going in. And so when they saw this, they're like, cool, we could do this. Like how, maybe if you were to do this, like how would this work? And so this scenario planning really created a container for us to have a conversation because we tend to work in an annual 4-year and at best 10-year schedule. And so this taking a 50, 100-year like view gave space for people to be like, okay, I don't have to make the decision now, but I can contribute to these conversations in a meaningful way. And then something, the output is like, oh, okay, I'm kind of bought into that. And I'd also say like here, like in the corner here is a pavilion. And that was, again, Cory was like, hey, like one of the biggest like significant values is canoe culture, carving culture right at the shoreline. Let's sketch in a pavilion, but like create the space. Like we wouldn't have thought of it because the project team is predominantly settler white folks who don't have that perspective. And so again, this just shows the benefits of having a cultural advisor on your team to hold the team accountable and to bring in this perspective. Cory.
Yeah, a lot of this was very much in the way of exercising the use of some of these open spaces, and not necessarily having to incorporate hard surfaces, but again, like softening everything we possibly can. Thanks, Angela.
I'm just gonna wrap to the end because we are getting to time and I know that we have questions. We are doing a pilot project in False Creek where we're taking some vertical seawall and we're terracing it back and connecting to the water. We're also integrating native plants, and this planting palette has been reviewed by Enlewatosh, an Indigenous landscaping and design firm at Tsleil-Waututh. So just like some lessons learned from this project, I think, yes, you can all see it, is that really like amplify and center Indigenous peoples and perspectives. Do it. It'll be great. And create relationships. It takes time and plan to maintain them. Plan for reciprocity in your projects. And this can look like a lot of different things. Amplify other people's works. Maybe there's someone who is looking for a skill building, networking opportunity on your team or outside your team. Pay for people's times. Pay consultants. This was a hot tip that I learned. Pay for consultants time to do new things. And you can articulate that in an RFP. You can have, some slush fund on the side to pay for reflection sessions. I had reflection sessions with the team and Cory and Charlene where we would just talk and reflect on what was going on. And I would pay them for that. Yeah, when you work with youth, really, create space and time to have mentoring and those skill building. That's really important. And yeah, work with creatives, work with designers, work with someone you don't know in a practice that you don't know, because I bet you need each other. And with that, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela and Cory. That discussion was really useful and really lovely to see the work that you guys were coming up with, and be really fun to check in with you sometime in the future to actually see when some of these projects actually are on the ground and people can actually see what comes out of it. That was really helpful. So we've got a question here from Maya. I'm curious about how the buy-in of the new approach to acknowledge, host, and restore is going. But you mentioned that it's not fully there yet. Are there reflections you can share with how that's going so far? Is it a project by project thing? Is there more or less support among staff?
So kind of putting on a systems hat or systems thinking hat on. So trying to the language goes to our norms and culture. So we're trying to change the culture. And for that, there are many ways to do it. You can have a top-down regulation or mandate, where you can, work with people and again, repetition and thread it into projects. And so that's the approach I've been taking for the most part. And so I would say, yes, amongst the staff leaders in engineering, they're bought onto this. And I think, we'll never be 100%. And that's okay. But we're a work in progress. And I think some projects are softer, different, more risk based than just, build for the worst case than we used to be. We are creating a policy about our role in coastal flood management, and we will be embedding the language and some of the principles from Sea to City in that. So that is an example of, going the regulatory codifying it into institutional memory. So it's a bit of culture changing and regulatory policy making. I would say management, yeah, people are into it. I don't think elected officials really fully understand it, and they don't have to. We just bring them projects that provide core city services, and good value.
Angela, maybe just if I can just on that question, I remember when you and I talked, several months ago about the article that we were doing together, that you kind of talked about how you got so many staff involved in the process with the idea that that would really bring them along. I know you've said that a little bit, but is there any more you'd like to say about that, in terms of how the impact that had?
Yeah, I mean, it had a huge impact, because at the time there was one of the structural engineers who he had to do a seismic bridge project, and he's like, "Hey, Angela, I'm deconstructing part of the seawall. Do you want to reconstruct something differently?" And because I was in your project, I now understand how I need to change. And I see this as an opportunity. And so that led to this pilot project that I'm doing in Yaletown. So yeah, that's been a good outcome. Cory.
That's wonderful. And how about Cory? Would you like to add to that, or to address a different issue there?
No. I think it's two part. Again, this was a great project for us to build our business and our platform from. And we met Jeff from Sea to City, Jeff from Space to Place on this project. And I think from an industry perspective, I think the industry is leaning into this idea of collaborating with cultural consultants to establish new terms of reference that is supporting potential opportunities to work alongside local government, whether it be municipalities or local government being the First Nations communities, to adapt and adopt new terms of reference. And then in partnership with Jeff from Space to Place, we're working with the city of Surrey right now on a park that we are implementing a lot of the lessons learned on Sea to City, and we're supporting staff from Surrey on developing new policies and guidelines and principles. I would like to support anyone here with the idea of maybe finding a budget or establishing a budget for cultural consultancy. And as an independent consultant, it's a growing industry. I'm one of a handful of people that are providing this service to the industry, whether it be architects, engineers, landscape architects. It's a growing industry, and if ever given an opportunity to not work with you, but provide you with some guidance and support on what that looks like, please reach out.
Thank you for that. So I'm just going to wrap up here and just say, first of all, thank you so much to Angela and Cory for taking the time today and for the incredible work that you've done that other people kind of can learn from and that people can build on. So thank you so much for that. And also just to let people know that Marie-Claude will be sending you a link to a survey that's prepared by our funder at FCM. They would really appreciate if you take a minute to fill out that survey, and we would appreciate if you do that as well. And then also that our next webinar featuring Winnipeg's urban forest strategy will take place on April 8th, and we welcome people joining us for that event. And once again, thank you for everybody joining us, and to Angela and Cory, thank you so much.